Senator Lankford.
Hey, Mr. Secretary, thank you. I appreciate getting a chance to get to know you. We did not serve together, but appreciate getting a chance to know you and your service, obviously, around the country and around the world and what you've done. I want to be able to touch on a couple of things that Senator Leahy had mentioned on earlier, and one of them was about immigration. You had in your written statement a pretty extensive statement there and a request for right at $1 billion in funding dealing with immigration policy with Mexico and with Central America. I want to dive into that a little bit more. What actions did the State Department take last summer when we saw the slowdown of the unaccompanied alien children coming into the United States? We saw that rapid stop, and it seemed to be a greater enforcement happening with Mexico and their Guatemalan border. Is that part of the strategy here of this $1 billion in request?
Yes. We need, there's clearly an enforcement component required.
Okay. What do you see as part of that? With that $1 billion, obviously, engaging, trying to not only deal with the root causes, as you put it in your statement, in Central America for those folks actually coming here, but actually the enforcement arm of that. What do you anticipate the State Department's operation to be in working with Mexico and Central America, and Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador especially?
Let me go through it very specifically for you, but I do want to add one other thing to everybody, because there was sort of a question about earlier about what we're doing in terms of the Ukraine policy. Look, we are not trying. The last thing we want to do is see the people of Russia pay the price for what we think are bad political decisions. But because of the sanctions we've put in place, nobody should diminish the impact that we've had through this united front. And I'll just take one minute on it. It's just quick. The ruble has dropped over 50% in the past 12 months, and it continues to be very volatile. The economic predictions for Russia are that it will go into recession this year. Inflation is predicted to exceed 15% this year. Standard & Poor's has cut their bond status to junk. The Central Bank of Russia has a capital outflow in 2014 that hit a record, $151 billion. And while it still has reserves of about $375 billion, it is not in a position to sort of do this interminably. So, we think it's been difficult. We've had to keep all of Europe united in that effort. So I think we think we're making some progress on it. Our preference is to have the Minsk agreement implemented fully and be able to de-escalate the situation. That's our goal. Now, coming to the question of Central America and the request, the $300 million of that $1 billion will help improve security, speaks specifically to security. And it will also deal with the extreme levels of violence. It will promote police reform. It will attack organized crime, and it will also help us in defense cooperation initiatives. In economic initiative, about $400 million is to try to promote trade, transport and border customs integration, enhance workforce development, facilitate business development, and help small businesses create jobs. And then the improved governance is to create more accountable, transparent public institutions. There's about $250 million that will reinforce democratic institutions, target corruption, strengthen efficiency, accountability, and transparency of the judicial system, and also improve the management of public funds and help create a competent civil service. So it's a big undertaking. Mm-hmm. We haven't had this kind of undertaking in Central America in decades. I believe, and I think the presidents of each of those countries believe, this can have a profound impact, and it will ultimately help us deal with the immigration challenge.
You have very sharp staff in Central America that I've met with and have flown down there and got a chance to meet with some of that staff and what they do on a daily basis. And they're doing a very good job for us, but it's one of the key issues of enforcement that also affects national policy as well as international policy and relationships there. I need to ask you about Syria. You had mentioned some of the work happening on chemical weapons and getting chemical weapons out of the hands of ISIS. We have a picture at this point based on all of the chemical weapons that have been pulled out in the agreements that have such. How often have those chemical weapons been used in the battlefield situation or suspected of being used in the last 6 months? Has that tapered off to zero? Where are we now as far as the use of chemical weapons?
Well, let me explain that. It's a good question, and it's important to draw a distinction here. All of the chemical weapons that are on the annotated international list of chemical weapons that are prohibited under the Chemical Weapons Convention were taken out. Those were declared, and to the most part, we think we found every one of them, and there's none of those that have been alleged to have been used. What has been used is chlorine, and chlorine is not on that prohibited list. But when mixed in a certain way, it can produce a toxic impact and be used. Now, that has been used. I think probably the numbers are classified, so I want to be careful here, but it's fair to say that the bulk of their use has been by the regime, but it is not exclusive.
Okay.
It appears as if there has been some by opposition and/or by ISIS.
Okay. The battle that's happening among religious extremism and among the Islamic community specifically that's raging so much that we're on the edges of and drawn into often, obviously is couched in religious terms. State Department does a tremendous amount of work worldwide dealing with carrying our values of religious liberty and recognition of all faiths. What changes is State proposing, and are you proposing worldwide dealing with religious liberty issues? Obviously, there's a lot of work that has already happened, but this has become a prime issue for us, is the recognition of religious liberty and that value being spread. So what changes are you proposing?
Well, I just swore in Ambassador David Satterfield, who is a well-known rabbi who's worked for 40 years on religious freedom, and he is going to be our ambassador in the State Department reaching out specifically on this issue of global religious freedom. In addition, I appointed the first faith-based outreach office in the history of the State Department. Sean Casey heads that up, and we have been reaching out to global interfaith initiatives in order to try to create common ground and reduce the mythology that surrounds a lot of the accusations made that stir people up in terms of violent extremism. We are deeply engaged, and in fact, I will be hopefully meeting with King Salman of Saudi Arabia later this week. King Abdullah, his predecessor, who just passed away, was deeply, deeply committed to this interfaith initiative, and we had many different conferences, meetings, outreach efforts going on to try to bring people together to work on religious tolerance, religious freedom, and to counter the messaging of the radical extremists. Now, we are opening an office in Abu Dhabi, a center that will be set up, managed, run by the Emiratis, who are funding this effort, but it will house a global group of players who will be engaged in social media response, working against the bigotry and the appeals that are appearing on the internet that are trying to seduce people into these radical extreme efforts, and also just generally trying to promote tolerance and religious freedom. We're working with leaders. There will be a conference of women taking place in the Middle East in the next months. There's another conference that will be taking place bringing religious leaders together to specifically address this. And some of these are interestingly being promoted by and initiated by Muslim nations in the region, Arab nations, others. So there's a lot happening on this front, and this was a very big part of the discussion at the White House summit in the past week, and a major priority of the State Department.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Senator